Okay. We are going to be getting into chapter 5 this evening. All right, let's look at Joshua chapter 5. Let's start by reading the first verse here. Now it came about, when all the kings of the Amorites, who were beyond the Jordan to the west, and all the kings of the Canaanites, who were by the sea, heard how the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan before the sons of Israel, until they had crossed, that their hearts melted, and there was no spirit in them any longer, because of the sons of Israel. What is this verse here telling us about the event that just occurred? Yeah. Yeah. We see that this news did not take long to get these people, did it? You know, this is something obviously that was very notable because this is before the time of cell phones, telephones, you know. Your news is getting from city to city by what? A person carrying it. What's that?
Word of mouth.
Word of mouth, exactly.
But they already knew a lot of the things the Lord had been doing
Mm-hmm.
for them, so they were already fearful.
Yeah. Do you think maybe they had some people watching the Israelites from afar? And, you know, we talked a little bit about how it says they went across quickly, but how, of course, there are, you know, several million people. It's hard to miss several million people, isn't it? Let's look at question number 1 here, because I think this is something that's important. He says, what psychological effect did the crossing of the Jordan have on the Amorites and the Canaanites? Yeah. What's the phrase that he uses there? Their hearts melted. What comes to our mind when we think of heart melting? Scared to death. Yeah. Scared to death.
I think it also tells us, even though they had already heard other things, this made an immediate impact on them, a different impact. It scared them more than what they already were.
Yeah. You know, one of the things about these people of the land is they all had their own gods. Had any of their gods done this before? No.
Nor did their gods prevent what just happened.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, you have this phrase, their hearts melted. They basically have come to the realization that they're out of luck, aren't they?
It's no fight or no resistance.
Mm-hmm.
Almost that it's going to overtake them.
Yeah. You know, most of the time, and this is important, I think, when we think about Jericho, most of the time, you know, if an army is coming to attack you, what do you do in return? You send out your army, right? But we see, you know, very much from Jericho, what is happening? They're all locked inside. They know they can't go against these people.
And it also they also came to a knowledge of the true and living God, which shows us that God makes himself known to even unbelief.
Yeah. Yeah. There was a king who got turned into an animal per se, like where he had to eat grass. What did he say after he was able to stand and talk again? Yeah, that's the kind of level that these people are at right now. They understand very much so that this God is more powerful than their supposed gods. All right, let's continue on to verse 2 here. He said, at the time the Lord said to Joshua, make for yourself flint knives and circumcise again the sons of Israel the second time. So Joshua made himself flint knives and circumcised the sons of Israel at Gilboath Harel. This is the reason why Joshua circumcised them. All the people who came out of Egypt who were males, all the men of war, died in the wilderness along the way after they came out of Egypt. For all the people who came out were circumcised, but all the people who were born in the wilderness along the way as they came out of Egypt had not been circumcised. For the sons of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness until all the nation, that is, the men of war who came out of Egypt, perished because they would not listen to the voice of the Lord, to whom the Lord had sworn that he would not let them see the land which the Lord had sworn to their fathers, to give us a land flowing with milk and honey. Their children whom he raised up in their place, Joshua circumcised, for they were uncircumcised. Let's look at note number 1 that Keith has here in the book. He says, regarding the fact God commanded the use of flint knives instead of metal instrument. Flint knives, as we see in Exodus 4:25, are sharpened by chipping away at the edge of stone so that clean, sterile stone is exposed. Since bacteria and viruses cannot grow in rocks, circumcision was thus performed with an instrument processing comparable sterility to today's surgical scalpels. In view of the likelihood of infection following of this operation with contaminated instrument, use of a flint knife was enormously beneficial and therefore commanded by the ultimate healer, or in this case, the preventer. You know, one of the things that we see as we study through this book and, of course, other books in the Bible is that God knew what we've only just recently learned. You know, it hasn't been that long ago that doctors thought the best course of action was to bleed someone out. You know, God here is giving them a way in which they could safely do something. You know, we see this as far as like, pork and whatnot as well. They're, commanded not to eat it. And of course, we know nowadays we have the technology to check the heat of that meat. But all these different little things that the Lord just says, I'm going to command you. He doesn't have to explain why, but we find out later when we come to this knowledge, oh, well, that might be one of the reasons why he did that. All right, let's jump into question number 2 here. Discuss, from a human military standpoint, would it have been a wise decision to disable the males of the army just as battle draws near? And then, of course, what made it okay in this case?
Generally, it was the males that were going into battle. And if they're going to be recovering from circumcision, they're not going to be battle worthy.
Yeah.
The idea is that their God was fighting for them.
Yeah. You know, any type of surgery is not recommended before you exert yourself, but this particular surgery, very much so not recommended before going into battle. But did it matter? God told him to. And so we see here what? That despite their perhaps, unwanting it to happen, they do it. They follow God's instruction. Because you think about it, all these people are going to be vulnerable. We have the instance where some men went into a city and told them, you can have this girl if all of your men are circumcised, right? So the men were circumcised, then what did these men do? They went in and wiped them out. Why did they wipe them out? Well, they were...
They defiled their sister.
Yeah. But they were obviously, unable to fight back at this situation. The Israelites just put themselves in this same situation, but we don't hear about them being affected at all, do we? Yes. Yeah, I think one of the things we have to remember is circumcision was what to the Israelites? Right. This was a sign of the covenant between them and God, between them and Abraham. God is giving them the land. One of the promises here, and they need to obviously follow up on their end of the deal there.
And
Yeah.
If there were spies that were looking out, like you pointed out before, men who were trying to see what was going on with Israelites, if they saw all this, that could have given them a false sense of hope. Because, dang, their army's not in good shape right now. Maybe everything's going to be all right. Whereas, with God fighting for them, it made it that much worse for them.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
When they wandered in the desert for 40 years, the men of war had died. The generation that did continue to wander in the desert failed to teach the children, failed to teach them the Torah, the law, failed to hold the children responsible and accountable to the rituals and practices of the law. They didn't circumcise those children. So when it says there that they were circumcised for a second time, you can only be circumcised once. So second time is those that were not circumcised. So that it's a generation, a whole generation that went without being taught God's law the way they should have been taught. But if you look at verses 8 and 9, verse 8, they remained there until they were healed. Verse 9, God says, the reproach of Egypt has now been set aside. You've left that behind. All this is also a sign. Circumcision not only was a sign in the flesh, but it's also a spiritual circumcision that later on Paul brings out in the New Testament. It wasn't just physical, it was also spiritual. So here in verse 9, there's this spiritual symbolism of circumcision. Now you're ready for a fresh start. Now you're able to possess the land, to live in the land of promise. Clean slate is what God is saying. And that's why that place, Gilgal, which means a city or the place of foreskins, Gilgal, Haresh, or whatever it's called, the pile of foreskins, where you would want to live in a town called foreskins. But it was named that way to remind them this is where it all ended, previous generation, and where it all began, this new generation.
Absolutely. Let's look at question number 3 here. What specific group of men had perished in the wilderness according to verse 4 and 6? And of course, what is the reason that this happened? Yeah, we have the men who were the warriors, if you will. They perished because of their lack of faith. Okay, and then let's look at number 4 here, which is what Ed was kind of relating to. He answered the fact of why the children weren't circumcised, because their parents had not taught them the commands. So not only were this generation not faithful themselves, but they also didn't teach their children. But then the second part of that says, when were the Israelite males supposed to have been circumcised? 8 days. 8 days. How many years late were we here for most of these people? Yeah. Now, let's think about this today. Are we supposed to be circumcised? Okay. There you go. There you go. And we see that in Colossians 2:11-13. Okay, let's jump to question number 5 here. Compare verses 7 with Numbers 14:31. How were the words of God confirmed? So what did Numbers 14:31 tell us?
The key phrase is that the children that they claimed would be led into a slaughter if they tried to take the land would be the very ones who would wind up taking the land. So it's an ironic twist that
Yeah. We see, several instances when you start looking at Scripture where God uses people, younger people, to do the things which the older people should have done. David wanted to build a temple. God said what? No. He said, who's going to do that? Yeah. Your son's going to do it. We see several instances throughout biblical history where, the men who should have known better, these are the men that crossed the Red Sea. They saw the miracle there, and yet what? They had a lack of faith there. So we see here beyond just the disfaithfulness, the parents themselves were not keeping, commands of the law. So how did these children have enough faith to, go through with circumcision and then march in the land? That's something I was, thinking of. If the parents are not raising their children properly, where are these children getting this knowledge from?
Everything they just been through. They just crossed over the river on dry ground. They've seen all these things happening. I would hope that it would be a lesson learned to know what not to do.
Some of these people had not been born at that time.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Well, God still gave them signs like manna
Mm-hmm.
every morning, light, their shoes weren't worn out. God was still present. And, you're wandering through the desert for 40 years on a promise that the land is going to be yours. And these adults have seen a lot of death and destruction, of course, because of their own disobedience. And it's hard to remain faithful when every day you're seeing these things. And if you're that new generation coming up, there comes a point in time when you kind of start questioning your parents' decisions. It hasn't worked for them.
Mm-hmm.
They're dead. They're beating their head against the wall. But we just crossed Jordan, as Sister Ella said. And this is an opportunity for us to start thinking differently. So,
Yeah.
that might have been that convincing thing to let's go ahead and try this.
Like he's saying, you've sat there as you've grown up watching your parents walk around in this tiny little spot of land in a circle for 40 years because, once again, their way didn't work. Let's pick back up here in Joshua 5 with 8. He said, "Now when they finished circumcising all the nation, they remained in their place of camp until they were healed. Then the Lord said to Joshua, 'Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you.'" So kind of going back to what Ed had talked about, a new start here. "So the name of the place is called Gilgal to this day." So Ed has already talked about how it got its name and why it's important to us. Well, let's discuss the meaning of the sentence here. It says, "Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." What is reproach? If a certain party reproached the president, what would that say about their view of the president?
Dishonored.
Mm-hmm. They disapprove of him, disagree with him, all these other synonyms that go along with that. Reproach in verse 9 would probably refer to things what? That God disapproved of. And of course, God disapproved of many things in Egypt, didn't he? When we look at the Egyptians, what were they doing over there? Yeah, we've got idols, we've got sacrifices, we've got a whole list of things here. And of course, to top that off, they what? Had enslaved whose people? God's people. Now, of course, God lets these people judge his people. But does that mean that he approves of what they do? We see throughout history the Assyrians, the Babylonians, he let them punish his people. But what happened to all these nations? They were punished themselves because he gave them the ability to punish his people, but a lot of these nations, what? They went too far. They did things in a way that they weren't supposed to. Yeah.
I look at it that way too.
It's like a parent putting a child in timeout, isn't it? God's over here saying, you got to stand to punishment for this long. Now that you've punished, let's talk about, okay, are we ready to get back to the task at hand? I think another thing, though, is that when we talk about this reproach is, how do you think the people of Israel felt being enslaved in Egypt and being thought of as slaved? We think about it, maybe a little bit of shame there too, right? You're the people of God, and yet what? You're over here making bricks for somebody else. And then, of course, and we even see that with those from the nation of Israel today, idolatry. When you know the truth and somebody's over here worshiping an idol, how does that make you feel? When you think about your parents are wandering through the land and they give Aaron a bunch of gold to do what? Make an idol. There's many instances of these people worshiping idols. There's probably a long list of reproaches that we could list there. But what is he saying here at this point? Ed mentioned a new start. What do they no longer have to worry about? These reproaches, right? Yeah. What about for us? What would be a parallel for us with this concept here?
As sins have been forgiven, you start.
Yeah. We undergo, baptism, we become a Christian. What do we not have to worry about anymore? How many people have we talked to or known that they say, well, I've done so many bad things, God's not going to want me. And God says what? Come in here, get cleaned up. We're not going to worry about that. All right, let's look at verse 10 here in 5. He said, while the sons of Israel camped at Gilgal, they observed the Passover on the evening of the 14th day of the month on the desert plains of Jericho. On the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate some of the produce of the land, unleavened bread and pain. The manna ceased on the day after they had eaten some of the produce of the land, so that the sons of Israel no longer had manna, but they ate some of the yield of the land of Canaan during that day. All right, so some timeline here. In the first month of the Jewish calendar, on the 10th, they crossed the Jordan, and each family had a lamb for the Passover. The 10th is the first day of preparation for the Passover. And of course, we're not sure exactly when the circumcision would have been, but obviously somewhere between maybe the 10th and the 14th. So on the 14th day, they had the Passover feast. On the 15th, they ate some produce from the land, because it's harvest time. The Jordan is flooded, so just like in Egypt with the rivers, when it's flooded, that's when they're growing all their fruit and vegetables. And then on the 16th, the manna ceased. Now, this obviously would be a huge change, wouldn't it? Because they've been gathering manna 6 days a week for how many years? 40 years. Let's look at note number 3 here that Keith has left us in the book. He says, verse 12, Matthew Henry offers this comment on the cessation of manna. He said, notice is taken of the ceasing of the manna as soon as ever they had eaten the old corn of the land, to show that it did not come by chance or common providence, as snow or hail does, but by the special designation of divine wisdom and goodness. For as it came when they needed it, so it continued as long as they had occasion for it, and no longer, to teach us not to expect extraordinary supplies when supplies may be had in an ordinary way. So he's saying what?
It didn't make manna anymore once they had access to it, but
Yeah.
You wanted them to be responsible.
Yeah. They take the first steps into their land, and they eat their own produce, and God says, okay, you're in the land, you've provided for yourself, therefore, you don't need me to give you stuff anymore. Okay, let's look at question number 6 here.
Jeff,
Yes?
because God had already given them the land. I mean, technically, it was already given them. They were supposed to go in and take it, but that had been prepared for them for a long time. And they just had to go and all the work was done. The hard work to get the harvest was done. They just had to go in and get it.
Yeah.
So it's, I don't know, I took that as something like, yeah, they don't need it anymore, but it's because God promised them that it would be here. And it was just another example to me of him fulfilling his promise of, this is what I'm giving you, now this is gonna stop, and you can see another example as to why I tell you to do what to do, because I know what's best for you.
Yeah.
He wants what's best for you.
And they had responsibilities. Everything wasn't, God wasn't gonna handle everything every time. I mean, he helped them the whole time. They had responsibilities themselves to do, to fulfill it, to do what they needed to do to take care of themselves.
Yeah, absolutely, they had responsibilities. You know, we go back to the very beginning where he says, be strong and courageous. If God was just going to hand things to them on a silver platter, you don't really have to be that strong and courageous because God's going to take care of it. It's like the first time you have to call the doctor yourself instead of your mama. You've got a responsibility. You know, you're going to do it. Mom's not going to do it anymore. You got to do it yourself. In the same way, God's saying, okay, I've got you to this point. You're in the land. You've eaten. Now it's your time to do what I've told you to do. He's given them instructions of exactly how to take the land. All they've got to do is follow that outline. Okay, question number 6 here. Could the Passover have been eaten lawfully by an uncircumcised Israelite male? So would that have told us that perhaps they didn't, partake of the Passover for 40 years or however long some of these people have been alive? Sure. So either they didn't do it or they were doing it improperly. Okay, let's look at number 7. This is the third time the observance of the Passover by Israel, up to this point in time, is recorded in Scripture. What were the other 2 times before this? Okay, so in Egypt.
When God delivered, I think, the last plague when he would strike the firstborn of each Egyptian, but he was going to spare the Israelites. But they had to do, had the new condition, they had to sprinkle lamb of the blood on their doorposts. But it was at that time when he used to strike the firstborn of the Egyptians. That was the first time that the Passover was observed. And the second time was in Numbers chapter 9 at Mount Sinai, where the brother once told me it's pronounced Mount Sinai, but on that occasion, in Numbers chapter 9, especially particularly verses 1 through 14, they observed the Passover on that occasion.
Yeah. 2 very monumentous occasions, once in Egypt there, and then once as it got to Sinai. So this is no small remembrance, is it? Okay, let's look at verse 13 here in Joshua. Now it came about when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for one of our adversaries?" He said, "No, rather I indeed come now as captain of the host of the Lord." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and bowed down and said to him, "What has my Lord to say to his servant?" The captain of the Lord's host said to Joshua, "Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. This is an interesting happening, isn't it, here? You know, the first thing that we want to ask ourselves, why was Joshua standing so close to Jericho by himself?
What do you have to worry about?
There you go. What did he have to worry about? God already told him the city is going to fall into your hands. You know, as far as he knows, that's his own front porch at this point, right? Maybe he's looking at it. Maybe he's planning it. Maybe he's, going out there looking beforehand before they take it over. Maybe he's what? I don't know. Praying? Even if God has told you he's given you this land, do you think perhaps he was praying frequently before events? And then how do we see this man? How is he described? Yeah, he had his sword drawn. He's described as the captain of the hosts of the Lord. Perhaps he was what? A big imposing man? Like obviously, he's something that has Joshua concerned because he didn't know who or what he was at this point. He didn't know if he was a threat. He said, are you with us? Are you against us? And he asked that question, what does Joshua do? He doesn't take a few steps back. He walks towards the man. And then he states what? That he is the captain of the Lord of hosts. And what is Joshua's immediate reaction? He falls on his face. So here's the leader of the Israelites. When it's just a man, he's saying, okay, who are you? What are you doing here? As soon as he says he's from God, we see Joshua's reaction is to be what? Humble, subservient. He falls before him. He shows great humility and respect. He refers to himself, what, as a servant. We once again come back to the point of Joshua does not show any shame with being a servant, does he? No, he never shows shame in being a servant to the Lord. Of course, he was told to remove his sandals because the place was holy. Why was this place holy? Yeah. Here is the presence of God, the captain of the guards of God. We had another instance where a bush was on fire, right? So we see what? Wherever God is, it's holy. That is a sacred place, right? And of course, the taking off of sandals would have denoted what during this time? It's respect, right? We see a lot of things like that today. You go to someone's house, a lot of times what? We take our shoes off. Why? Because we don't want to get the floors dirty. What we see here is, maybe an extreme example of that. You take off anything that, God hasn't created. God's creation is the only thing that is going to touch this ground. What is the point of this encounter, though?
I think it offers reassurance to Joshua.
Yeah. Even though he's just crossed the ground, the Jordan River on dry ground, God sends a messenger to him that basically shows him, look, you're about to take this city. I'm literally right here. Here is a, physical manifestation showing you that I'm right here with you. I'm helping you. Yes.
Assuming that this was a theophany, that this is God.
Okay.
There's people that feel that it's not God, but I assume that it was God. This is a reminder to Joshua, what he said to him in chapter 1 to 3, that every place on the sole of your foot treads, I When you pass the baton to Joshua, don't look a little left or to the right. Be courageous, be strong. In chapter 1, verse 5, no man will be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just like I was with Moses, I'll be with you. So now, it only stands to reason, again, if it is a theophany, that when he said to Moses, take off your sandals because you're standing on holy ground, would also be said to him as this chapter so abruptly ends. There's no further discussion about this captain of the army of the Lord of hosts. It just ends. Chapter 6 begins with Jericho.
Yeah.
Because he's about to go into his first major battle. And he has to rely not on the power, the wit, or the sword, but on the faith in God.
Yeah. And as we get into, the taking of Jericho, we see that it is not a traditional battle at all, is it? Like, they're not charging the city, they're not trying to knock things down, they're not trying to climb the walls. The whole taking of Jericho is once again showing the power of God. All right, we'll go ahead and stop there since the second bell has rung. Any further questions or comments before we're dismissed tonight? All right, well, thank you for your participation with class.